In this next section, I'm going to deal with safety and health regulations, scientific research, some myths surrounding the development of the computer and the internet. I'm going to deal with pollution, rivers and water rights, overfishing, the broadcast spectrum, air traffic control, global warming, meteors, and medical services. I refer to these issues sarcastically as the impossibles because they're actually quite easy issues that can be dispatched rather quickly once you know what to look for, but statists tend to view them as utterly insurmountable. Regulations. First is the issue of what needs to be regulated, and how does the regulation of a new product occur? Who best knows how a blow dryer would break or how an electric shaver would break? Who knows how best to package food? Well, the answer should be obvious. The producer knows best. But does the producer have an incentive to produce the best, the safest product within reason? Well, in the long run, they certainly do. And thus they have an incentive to prevent an outbreak of an unsafe product or service that their brand will be tainted with. Having already established law in a stateless society makes this problem a lot easier. If a firm sells tainted products that harm someone, then they will be liable for restitution to the victim. Kind of like how they are today, only it is my prediction that people will prefer more restitution-based punishments as opposed to punitive damages. In addition, prior to the overweening state intervention in all industries, there were agencies like Underwriters Laboratory and the American Medical Association. Now, on a whole, I despise the AMA, as they were a crucial lobbying group involved in restricting medical services, but they did provide a useful rating system for drugs. Today, drugs are FDA approved or they are called supplements. Back then, they were AMA approved, or drugs that weren't approved by the AMA were called patent drugs. An advantage of the system is that you could decide for yourself if you wanted to take an experimental drug, not the FDA. Similar to beta testing with games, only with medicine, if there's a bug in the medicine formula, people die. Now, if you're going to die anyway, you might as well try an experimental drug. And the data you provide if you do die would help speed up the development of the drug for everyone else. Underwriters Laboratory still tests and certifies appliances, electronics, and industrial products through randomized testing and unannounced inspections and all sorts of little things to do to make sure that they're getting a representative sample of the products being tested and inspected and all that stuff. In fact, Underwriters Laboratory provides the starting point for most state regulators. There's 50 states, so I can't really go into this in much detail, but when you look at states having product safety regulations, they usually use Underwriters Laboratory as precedent for the state regulations. Unfortunately, people today are so accustomed to the false certainty of universal regulation that it'll take a shift in thinking for them to actually look at the labels of what they're buying, instead of being like little babies putting everything in front of them in their mouth. So it's going to take a shift in terms of the way people buy stuff and a shift in responsibility to move towards a more responsible and mature society. Now, nobody is against regulation. So when somebody says, I'm for regulation, that just begs the question. We're all for regulation. We're talking about the state. Should the state do it? Is the state best at doing this? What are some problems of the state having a monopoly on regulation? Things like that. To say that I'm for regulation implies that someone else is not for regulation. And furthermore, it begs the question of what regular even means. So, we're all for regulation. Everyone is for regulation. Someone who says that they're for regulation or there are these other people who are against regulation, that's just a childish simplification. Moreover, safety is not everything. You could have some potato chips that are virtually certainly not going to have any contaminants, and each individual chip can be put in some vacuum container and zapped of any bacteria. And that bag of chips that is super safe, 100% certain to be safe, can cost you $300. No. There is a limit on the safety of products that people are willing to buy. There is a limit on safety, on how much people value safety. Safety is not sacred. It is just one aspect of a product. A car can have good gas mileage, a nice motor, and nice safety features. I should have been able to end this section just at there are legal agencies in a stateless society and they will enforce punishment for firms that harm the consumer, but I just wanted to add on the fact that there are regulatory agencies in the stateless society, and there have been regulatory agencies that preceded state regulation as well, just to kind of bolster my claim, make it a little bit more real, because that's something that actually happened. Unfortunately, there are so many myths put forward, and I can't count how many times Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, is referenced as a credible source. And I think it's because kids learned about it in school. Not only was that book fiction, but the Chicago stockyards had thousands of employees and tourists every year. And during this time, it was under the jurisdiction of Illinois state regulators. The stockyard employees denied the claims made in The Jungle, and Upton Sinclair himself actually opposed the legislation that was passed as a result of his book. And of course, there were some kangaroo inspections following that, but basically it was because of his book. And Upton Sinclair opposed the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 because he knew the regulation was tailored to help big meat packers and shut out the small ones, as the regulation benefited economies of scale. Links in the description to a more thorough debunking of the myths surrounding the Chicago stockyards. All right, moving on to scientific research. The argument for the state on this ground is that it costs less for a firm to copy scientific research than to do it themselves. Therefore, in a completely free market, firms will just copy research and there will be very little original research. Therefore, the state must intervene to, 1, fund research to overcome this free rider problem, and 2, to grant patents or temporary grants of monopoly privilege on products. Well, the first point is that according to Edwin Mansfield, the late economist at the University of Pennsylvania, it costs roughly $65 to copy $100 worth of research. In OECD countries across all industries over the period of time that he analyzed it. This is because copying a drug is not like copying the answers on a Scantron. You have to already understand how all of that stuff works to be able to make sense of a drug. If I was handed a blueprint for Viagra pills, the manufacturing process, the ingredients, all that stuff, or I was handed a blueprint of a plasma television screen, I wouldn't be able to reverse engineer that. I could sell it to some company that could reverse engineer it, but I could not do it myself. It requires an already existing infrastructure, people who know these things, who are in the loop, so to speak, and have the equipment to successfully reverse engineer equipment. I can't reverse engineer a Viagra pill. It takes infrastructure to do so. And when a company does that, they do reverse engineer some product, then what? They can sell off-brand Viagra. So sure, it's the same thing, but people gravitate toward name-brand items and they spend a premium for name-brand items. Furthermore, reverse engineering does take a little bit of time. So even ignoring this name-brand effect, during the time it takes to reverse engineer, the original inventor has a temporary monopoly. All right, you say, that applies to applied research, or that explains applied research, but what about basic research? That is research that has little direct profit motive and which benefits society more diffusely. What's the profit motive for basic research that doesn't necessarily lead to a new product? Well, according to Terence Keeley, who links in the description for this, basic research is actually the best way to come up with breakthroughs in applied research. That is, it's the most profitable form of research to fund. And I can imagine why this might be. Breakthroughs, from what I know, are not a matter of formula, but of something new. You don't know what the breakthroughs are going to be a priori, so basic research is the best way to fund it. If you could just fund very specific applied research and have a breakthrough, have a kind of a prescribed breakthrough, then it wouldn't be that profitable, as inventing new things wouldn't be very profitable. Of course, you can point to government spending on research leading to lots of things, like the internet or computers or various computer installments, although that's way over-exaggerated. But so what? So what? Money was taken from one sector and spent on another. And also, according to Keeley, every dollar spent on government research causes $1.25 less to be spent on private research. Now, I have a video where I go into more detail on this, but safe to say, there is a significant crowding out effect, and copying research is not something that is that easy to do. Now, to the internet. With all that in mind, when one points to state involvement in the development of the internet, my response is always, so what? The state also built a lot of roads, and we use roads. So what? Does that mean there'd be no roads in the absence of state funding? In the Soviet Union, the state built just about everything. Does that mean if the Soviet Union fell and you had something more of a free market, that there wouldn't be shoes? As it turned out, ARPANET, the X25 networks, and Usenet formed the original backbone networks of the internet. In 1973, DARPANET worked out a reformulation to unite the networks, ARPANET, the X25 networks, and Usenet, to create a internetwork protocol, which is the TCP/IP thing that we use to this day. The current protocol has no way to price packets, and so the system is overused like any public good. Packet pricing would make people pay for internet use the same way they pay for water or electricity or telephone use. But since the protocol developed early on was not originally designed for commercial use, we are stuck with this overused setup that suffers from the tragedy of the commons. And the system was designed with research in mind, where people wouldn't be, downloading images, videos, and stuff, and going in sites like YouTube. They weren't predicting that. They were predicting academic research, kind of dry stuff, text, maybe a few basic images someday down the line. And the reason a more efficient protocol hasn't developed yet is because of network effects. That is, the same reason people don't leave Facebook, even though Facebook does a lot of BS. The reason people don't leave YouTube, because YouTube, well, for a long time did a lot of BS. YouTube's getting a lot better. But people didn't leave YouTube despite YouTube's BS because of network effects. That is, people wanted to go to YouTube because people were on YouTube. People use TCP/IP because people use TCP/IP. It's, imagine trying to create a whole new protocol. You would basically be creating a whole new internet. There's no way I can tell how the internet would have developed without state funding. It probably would have developed a little bit later, but not as much later as one might think. Local area networks in businesses and universities have been developing protocols to network computers over short distances in the 1960s and 1970s. And, they've been doing this back toward the tail end of vacuum tube computers. Moreover, other protocols, IPX, AppleTalk, and NBF, had been developed. Those are three possible alternatives to TCP/IP. And as in all other industries, one standard would have won out, similar to standardized credit card sizes, standardized soda can sizes, standard rail gauges. Standardizations wins out in industries. So what would the backbone networks have been if ARPANET didn't exist? Well, probably the X25 networks, CompuServe, TimeNet, Euronet, PSS, DataPack, Telenet, and Usenet. Since these were the networks that formed the original backbone alongside ARPANET in the 1970s, and which businesses and other academic institutions used. In other words, the private sector had developed LANs, local area networks. They had developed protocols with these LANs and had developed independent backbone networks. So what the hell did ARPANET even do? Well, they developed the largest backbone network in the beginning, and since they used TCP/IP, it crowded out all of the other protocols, and so we're basically stuck with TCP/IP because of network effects. Without ARPANET, people who wanted to use the internet would have to use some other backbone, and those institutions, would have made arrangement with those other networks, CompuServe, Telenet, whatever, and they would have made arrangement with those instead of ARPANET. And so those networks would have become a lot bigger, and they would have used a different protocol. And that's another funny thing that people will say, well, the protocol was developed by ARPANET, as if this was some breakthrough that hadn't been developed by private agencies. And protocols had been developed by private agencies. And the only reason we're using the ARPANET protocol, TCP/IP, is because it was the protocol for the largest backbone at the very beginning, and so we have network effects that kept building and building, and to this day. Moreover, it's striking how quickly the internet started as soon as the integrated circuit came on the scene in 1959. Now, it's as if once integrated circuits became commonplace by 1968 that the idea of the internet started to be developed. Now, I don't know enough about this topic to know how direct that connection is, but it seems it would be a significant coincidence if the development of the integrated circuit didn't have anything to do with the development of the internet. And so having ARPANET coming on the scene right as the integrated circuit became more commonplace calls into question how much of an effect ARPANET really had. That is, by the time the integrated circuit, what I'm saying is that by the time the integrated circuit started coming online, it seems that the internet's time had come. And it was only then that government funding came in and made it look as if ARPANET ushered in the way to the internet when really it didn't. So the reason I talk about this is because what will happen is a free marketeer will say, look at the glory that is the free market internet. All of the broadband cables laid by cable companies, browsers developed by companies for free, and they've managed to make money somehow. Sites that are all made by companies, Facebook, YouTube, these are all this wonderful free market. And what the statist will do is he'll respond by saying, oh yeah? Well, none of this would have been possible without ARPANET and the protocol that they developed. And that was a government program. And so what I'm saying here is that that story that the government was necessary for the internet is probably wrong. It is very clearly wrong. The development of the computer itself has been a process of leapfrog from market development to state development back to market development. First, there's lots of computators. There are the Babbage machines and steam-powered computers and all these kind of stuff. But the first real computer, thing that we would call a computer today, was the Z series, and that was developed by Konrad Zuse in Germany. The Z1, Z2, Z3, Z4, not to be confused with the Z series destroyers made by the German Navy at around the same time. And so the first computer that we would really call a computer with vacuum tubes and stuff was developed by Konrad Zuse. And then later on, most vacuum tube computers were developed for businesses and universities. Between around 1940 to 1955 was when the bulk of the vacuum tube computers were invented. Following about 1954, 1955, transistors started to become online and become more reliable. And so after about 1955, vacuum tube computers were on the decline. But during that period of vacuum tube computers, most of them, and there are a lot of them, I recommend looking at the Wikipedia page and looking at all the vacuum tube computers that were created. There were a lot of them. And so a lot of people look at ENIAC and say, wow, ENIAC was this amazing machine, groundbreaking. It wasn't groundbreaking. It wasn't even the largest. And I'm kind of puzzled why ENIAC loomed so large in people's minds. Anyway, following the vacuum tube computers, you had transistor computers. And IBM developed private transistor computers for large business machines. And these were developed at roughly the same time as some transistor computer used for missile guidance for the Air Force. But the point is that a private company made the leap to transistor computers as well without relying on government basic research for that. Then you had integrated circuits that was developed by Texas Instruments and some guy from Fairchild, Robert Noyce, whatever. Early on, quote, over half, close quote, of the markets for integrated circuits was the military buying integrated circuit chips for their missile guidance systems and things like that. Only by around 1968, when the price of integrated circuits fell, did the private sector become larger than the state as a share of the integrated circuit market. It should also be noted just how quickly the internet developed after integrated circuits became the standard. Combine ARPANET with the primary funding of integrated circuit development, and the period between 1962 and 1974 was a time when the state appeared to be the primary financier of computer development. But some more factors to take into consideration when looking at the development of the computer and the necessity of state funding for basic development of the computer. Roughly half of the funding for the development of the computer between 1941 and 1974 on aggregate came from the state. After 1974, it was largely irrelevant, as the market had eclipsed the state in this industry. So, how would computer research have been funded without state spending during these critical early phases? Well, first off, it's only about half over this period, not all. So, we're already halfway there in terms of having the same funding on a total market. Second, in my proposed system, there is still defense on a total market, and there are still defense agencies, and this defense will have research and development. Currently, U.S. defense spending is about $800 billion, and about 10%, or $80 billion, is research and development. If we assume a similar proportion devoted to R&D by the defense agencies in a stateless society, that would be $10 billion. 3, there are more resources in a stateless society. And this is true. Like, free markets produce more. Just end of story. And this means that there would have been a larger market for computers and more money to be donated to whatever private research funds there would be. So if the market is 10% larger, we'll say, then this would put us at about 55% fuzzily, ignoring any defense funding for research. 4, the amount spent on market analogs of state services is less than paying for state services today. And so lower, quote, taxes, close quotes, means that the private sector, along with being larger, is less taxed. Right? So from roughly a third of GDP during the Cold War to about 5%. For this argument to work, you have to assume that the stateless society works otherwise. So multiply the 55% by 0.25 and add that to 55%, and so we're already at 68.75%, ignoring defense spending. Then we have state funding of computer projects for defense is not as good as university grants for pure research. Because the projects for a computer, for the NIAC, for example, are applied, and they are for specific purposes. That is, they're paying you to develop a computer that can calculate ballistic trajectory and missile guidance. So this is applied research. And so while useful, this makes defense spending somewhat less useful dollar for dollar in terms of actual technological advancement as private funds are. So private funds are more useful dollar for dollar because defense is much more applied. And 6, the research agencies can take a hit. By that I mean if theoretically funding was cut by half, that doesn't mean the research output would be cut by half. Perhaps a 50% cut would reduce research, if we treat it like some discrete aggregate, by 25%. So by this I mean spending more on research and development reaches a point of diminishing marginal utility. And so all told, it is my opinion that funding for development of the computer and the internet between 1941 and 1980 would be between 80 to 90% on a total market of what it actually was in the past, and without patents stifling development, technological advancement in these areas would be roughly the same now as it was then, if not greater. But this is all hindsight. In hindsight, we know that the development of the computer was extremely important. What's going to be the most important thing 30 years down the line that we must perform basic research on now? You don't know, and neither does the government. We look in the past and we see, oh wow, the computer, that was very important. So lesson learned, it's good to have a large amounts of funding for basic research for things that are going to be very beneficial 30 years in the future. Like, okay, that's a nice argument, but what is that thing? Looking forward, what is that thing? And when you ask that question, this whole argument for state funding and basic research becomes a little bit more tenuous. All right, next section, air traffic control. Air traffic control is an objection I got from in Mendham. This is the only person I've ever got this from, and it's a really odd one. Air traffic control was originally done privately, no problems, and it's done privately today, no problems. An argument Mendham made was that, well, what the air traffic controllers say is backed up by law. That's why they're so effective. And but the thing is, there are legal ramifications, and there's a sophisticated legal precedent to deal with that today in the U.S. And of course, if you looked at my previous section on law in a stateless society, basically we're taking the precedent of the law into a new environment where it can then evolve. Really, you need to have seen the last section on law in order to understand what I'm talking about. But anyway, things like precedent for air traffic control, yeah, that would be taken over to a stateless legal order and could then evolve if some of the precedent was rotten. So that's really not a problem. Really odd objection I got. Air pollution. Air pollution is a matter of property rights violation. If someone is pumping a bunch of smog into the air, he can be liable for a class action lawsuit, and everyone in a given region can be given, say, $5. And the lawyer who proves the case would be given a reward himself. He'd be given a little bounty, and to cover his calculation costs, how did he figure out that there was all this stuff going on? Right, whatever. There's precedent for this. Water pollution is similar and applies to people who own property on the river, lake, or ocean front. Diverting the water flow, what that does is that affects the property of others, so it would be, we could view it as a property violation, diverting the water flow to a certain degree. Right? There's a bit of ambiguity as to how much you should be allowed. I mean, if you take a cup in the stream, does that divert the water flow and constitute a property violation to someone 10 miles down the stream? Obviously not. So there's a bit of ambiguity as to what constitutes diverting the water flow in a way that damages others. But, that's ambiguity to be sorted out by the legal agencies, and there's already precedent for that. And so that would be a property violation unless the appropriate contracts are signed in advance, like a dam having to buy, property or buy guarantees from people in an area where that the dam is going to affect. Overfishing is a more complicated issue, but one which can be easily summarized here. There are systems today involving international transferable quotas, or ITQs, or commonly referred to as catch shares. Now, these are shares that individuals, quote, own, close quote. They have a claim on X many fish in a certain region, right, based on the migrations of fish stock and stuff like that. And anyone who is caught fishing above their catch share would face some penalty. And since a stateless society has law, the law can simply enforce the catch shares. Think of it like a law against murder or unjust killing, except this is one against fish. Only certain people can kill so many fish. There are also some proposals that involve tagging fish and treating them like cattle, with schools of fish being followed, by herds of boats that use sonar to basically treat, their herds of fish and stuff. And this, of course, would not be as clear-cut as cattle today, as there could be some cross-pollination between schools of fish, and the owners of separate schools wouldn't know. It would be kind of a fuzzy understanding of what your fish are, and that fuzziness would extend to any disputes of someone, fishing in your herd, your herd of tuna, or whatever. But there are ways to estimate this, and there are already proposals to do with this. Tagging fish is already being done today for other purposes, not for this. And so, there are ways to get good estimates of your fish herd. And I don't know which system will win out, the catch share or the herd, but hopefully the latter. I prefer the herd system, but I don't know. I'm not an expert on this. I'm just doing a very cursory overview of this. But from what I can see, if you have a legal system in place, and you have these catch share systems in place, and you have a tagging system in place, this does not appear to be a very difficult problem. If defense against other states can be dealt with by stateless society, then so can defense against meteors, and so defense against meteors will work through the same mechanism. Perhaps an increase in the defense due, or an introduction of a separate meteor due, but it would require operational universal support. Again, all this stuff is dependent on the prior section, law and defense. I've thought about global warming a little bit, and the way I've come up to deal with it is to just treat it like any other property violation. Pumping out something that changes the climate in a negative way can be treated as a property violation against the entire planet, because you're doing something that harms someone else in kind of an indirect fashion. But if you want to get reductionistic, then everything is indirect. When you pull the trigger of a gun and it fires off a bullet that goes through someone's head, you don't just say, well, it was the bullet that did it. No, you did it. And so, saying, well, it's indirect, that's kind of a philosophical issue. And so what I can see happening is that since the entire planet is not within the legal order of a stateless society, someone who's releasing greenhouse gases would just have to settle on reimbursing members of the stateless society for damages caused by greenhouse gases that they did in a class action lawsuit. Or wouldn't it really be a class action lawsuit? It would be more like an annual class action greenhouse fee, basically. What you have to pay every year based on how many greenhouse gases you use. And I don't really care much about this, and I actually think global warming is nonsense based on the incentives of the researchers. Like climatologists obviously have an incentive to say that there's global warming because that makes their field of study more important. Environmentalists obviously love it because they live for environmental regulation and control and more of their little bureaucratic empire building. And, do-gooders love it as well because they're do-gooders. And they want to have some drama, and they want to fight the big bad corporations and stuff like that. So, because of the interests on the global warming issue, that's why I think it's nonsense. I'm not qualified to analyze the science, okay, but just based on the institutional interests, that's why I think it's nonsense. But to anyone who cares, right, you can think of a way to calculate and distribute, perhaps electronically, the funds that come from the annual class action greenhouse gas fee. That's the system I've come up with. And, of course, this would require operationally universal support for this, which I don't think you're ever going to get. But maybe you will. Maybe you can come up with a way to to fund this despite not having operational universal support. Everyone then gets a few bucks each year from all of the other users of greenhouse gases based on the amount of damage it supposedly does to their property. Lots of question begging with the solution. What is the correct fee? Who determines the fees? But as I said, I'm not interested in this enough to provide a detailed answer. I'm just laying a very meta frame here. And as I said in a previous section, I don't expect my specific answers on these issues to be, the core answers for an anti-statist movement that gets majority support in elections 50 years down the line. Right? I'm just saying, look, these things can be done. Here are ways it can be done. Here are the sorts of mechanisms that we're working with in a stateless society, not necessarily that my answer is going to be the best. Okay, then we have the radio spectrum. State courts had solved the issue of ether homesteading, appealing to the homesteading criteria in the Western Territories for precedent. This established an active use criteria for airwave ownership. The law was indeed decided by the Illinois State Court, but such a ruling could easily be arrived at by a legal agency in a stateless society as well, and if this law were still in place, it would carry over as precedent. And since the court had decided on homesteading, this meant that the state could not dole out the spectrum based on ideology and bribes like it does now. This homesteading precedent was established in November 1926 in the case between the Chicago Daily Tribune and the Oak Leaves Broadcasting Station. It was determined that since the Tribune had used that spectrum first and sunk a great deal of capital into its usage, the Tribune was the rightful owner of the spectrum in question. In December 1926, Congress passed a resolution stating that no private property rights in the ether would be respected. So just 1 month later, Congress nullified this decision. On February 23, 1927, Congress passed the Federal Radio Act of 1927, which gave the Federal Radio Commission the power to grant and deny licenses. The justification was to control the, quote, growing anarchy of the airwaves, close quote. Prior to the Oaks and Tribune case, it could reasonably be said that there was a commons problem that stemmed from a lack of property rights in the airwaves. But of course the issue had already been solved by the Illinois court. And when that happened, Congress immediately outlawed that solution and then imposed its own centrally planned solution. A solution had already been attained using homesteading as precedent, which the state immediately struck down and instead has imposed its own central planning. This is probably why radio and television have incredibly bland pro-state commentary. With banal pro-democracy hacks like Rush Limbaugh and Michael Savage, they're considered the fringe. They're the radicals. Rush Limbaugh and Michael Savage. That's radical, you see. There is no fringe to speak of. It's all pro-democracy, middle-of-the-road swill. And let's hope they don't do the same with the internet. Before talking about medical services, it should be clear that food is more important than medical services. Places have tried to have state-run food production, or we could call it universal meal care or something like that, and the result is always famine. In the USSR, China, North Korea are the three that come to mind. In the USSR, you had the ridiculous situation of 50% of the food coming from 10% of the land, because that 10% was the private plots. We can look at the U.S. and see that as state intervention in the medical industry has increased, prices rose and supply of medical services has fallen. Since 1900, the U.S. population has increased by 284%, yet the number of medical schools has declined by 26%. By 1963, despite a huge growth in demand, the number of doctors per capita was roughly the same as in 1900. Around the time of the Flexner Report, which was a report basically promoted by the American Medical Association, there were about 166 medical schools in the U.S. By the 1940s, there were 77, a 54% reduction. Controls on medical services also eliminated the fraternal societies, which would hire one doctor on call at bulk rates for the entire lodge, and they restricted the activities of homeopaths, pharmacists, midwives, nurses, and chiropractors. Read up on the fraternal societies. An excellent article on that is in the description of this video. So what is happening in the U.S. is that the supply of medical services is restricted due to state control of its production and preventing new medical schools from forming. Thus, when more money is spent on medical services, it doesn't result in a concomitant increase in the supply of medical services because supply is legally restricted. It just results in the relatively fixed supply of medical services getting more and more expensive. Now, in Britain, for example, they have the same problem, as they have legally restricted medical services, but they get around this problem a little bit by rationing medical services. Thus, the price doesn't balloon out of proportion. Now, whether there are longer or shorter waiting periods is actually quite irrelevant. Here are the number of doctors per capita in the US and the number of doctors per capita in the UK. Both the US and the UK have a severely restricted medical supply, yet the UK pays less per person. And this is because the relatively fixed supply of medical services are rationed in the UK instead of being bid up and up and up and up like they are in the US. The price is kept low and rationed, meaning more people are willing to pay at the artificially low price. But there's, of course, not enough supply at that artificially low price because the government's restricting supply in the UK. And so there's very probably, virtually certainly, a shortage. Now, whether this shortage manifests in long waiting periods or people simply not using government medical services or pulling out their own teeth or whatever, doesn't really quite matter. It's still a manifestation of this rationing dynamic. I find it so odd that statists will argue with this point. Like, this is analytically true. These economic laws are not just my opinion. Like, what, are the doctors in the UK just working harder and longer so that despite the same number of doctors per capita, everyone gets more services at a lower cost in the UK? Are they just more giving than the doctors in the US or something? And even if you could show that UK doctors are just nicer people or whatever the heck this could be, then you still have to show that it's the central planning that makes these doctors much nicer people. Statists are in Candyland on this issue. Apply this production and distribution model to any other good or service, and it's retarded and, some say, even deadly. The way to solve the problem in both the US and the UK, and I would say improve it just about everywhere else, is to free up the supply and remove the barriers that keep it restricted. This should be the first and foremost goal. There's no way to predict, but it's my estimation that in a stateless society, the supply of medical services would double in about 20 years. And I'm just looking at the physicians per capita in places like Belarus and stuff. The quality would be a bit lower at first, of course, because you're bringing new schools online, and they won't be as calibrated as the old ones, but they will be eventually. And moreover, the doctors won't be so overworked, because there will be more of them. So why do those other countries have more physicians? Well, I don't care enough to look into it that deeply, but my theory is this. The US has a crippled market. Germany has central planning. Now, a crippled market can beat central planning. It just depends on how crippled it is. So in Germany, you have people paying taxes, and the state just kind of dumbly allocates it. That's what the state does. It's like a giant emotionless baby that just pushes resources around. But because of this, what incentive does the German medical establishment have in restricting supply? None. None, because they're not earning profits. They have no incentive to restrict supply in this system, in this centrally planned system. It doesn't have any incentive to provide good service either. Now, this is not to say that there aren't good-spirited doctors or managers who will fire incompetent medical staff, or that all government employees are heartless or whatever, but the institutional incentives just aren't there. While as a state program there are institutional barriers to increased efficiency, there is no incentive to restrict supply either. It's just resources, here's the money, do this, and they do it. On the flip side, because the US system is quasi-private, it typically scores highest in quality ratings, but this higher quality is definitely overshadowed by how expensive and inaccessible it is. On a market, however, there is an incentive to restrict supply, and that will make the services of each individual doctor more valuable, and will give organizations like the American Medical Association more bargaining power, and for whatever other reasons they would prefer to have a smaller number of elite doctors, more revered doctors. But the AMA was not able to do this without state intervention. Remove state intervention and the supply will rise to meet real demand, and the price will crash when all of the government money gets removed. Medical services is a topic that I have faced the most irrationality on, more than race and intelligence of all things, more than defense, more than privatization of police and roads. No, medical services. And I think it's because these people have something of a Candyland vision of what universal health care is, and of course they fall for the mythology of free market USA. Europe is better than USA in this regard. Therefore, and USA is, of course, free market USA. Everyone knows that. Therefore, central planning must beat free markets in medical services. That's the simplistic logic chain that these people go down on. Now, let me just say that I'm not against statists having a system of, quote, universal health care, close quote, if they want it. Furthermore, just as a matter of fact, the people in the U.S. who support universal health care tend to actually a bit wealthier than the people who oppose it. And based on that, it probably wouldn't be all the poor people huddling together in universal health care, but it would actually be all the rich and very poor people in a socialist system and the middle income people with a, quote, private, close quote, system. And of course, I'm using the term private and socialist in the context of a stateless society, so just bear with the terminology migration. Also, in a completely free market, a social insurance scheme wouldn't be constrained by ridiculous insurance laws that, for example, prevent you from buying medical insurance across state borders. So if I don't convince you on anything here, just remember that in a total market, you can have your universal health care. In my opinion, you will have a better universal health care system on a total market than you would in a compulsory state system, because there would be market discipline and you wouldn't have lots of stupid little regulations. I recommend looking at this channel called the Institute for Justice that goes through just stupid self-serving regulations by industries all across the economy. If you were a statist, this would just be the best of both worlds, right? Having universal health care in the context of a total market. But in my estimation, universal health care is just as, if not more, nonsensical than universal meal care. I predict that if a state were removed, liberals would jump for joy and start making market analogs of the state programs that they've always wanted. That's what I believe would happen. And these programs won't necessarily fail. They'll just be outgrown, kind of like the kibbutzes in Israel were. As, you had people going to Israel, ooh, we can finally have communism. And so they were all excited and made these kibbutzes. The kibbutzes, I mean, they worked. They didn't fail. They gave kind of stagnant standard of living. And then people just got bored with it. The revolutionary zeal wasn't there. It wasn't the utopia they thought it would be. The capitalist rest of Israel was a lot better off, and so people just grew out of it. But if it really is so much better than what I advocate, if the universal health care is really so much better, then you can gloat at all the poor slobs like me who are just stuck in our free market fundamentalist ways. So really, you have nothing to lose.